How did Darth Plagueis create Anakin Skywalker, the Jedi Chosen One? Greetings, students of the Force, and welcome back to the archives. In his life, Plagueis did many things to put him in the running for the most powerful of Sith Lords. One of those accomplishments was undeniably his ability to influence the midichlorians to create life. This, of course, was the central talking point Palpatine used in seducing Anakin to the dark side with the story of his old master. However, the detail that Palpatine left out was the possibility that Plagueis was inadvertently responsible for Anakin's birth. It is true that the actions of this Dark Lord led to the coming of the Chosen One. Yet, there are a lot of misconceptions surrounding these events, specifically the common misunderstanding that Plagueis actually meant to create Anakin. So join us today as we open a holocron and take a deep dive into how Plagueis accidentally created the Jedi Chosen One. There is quite a bit of build up to the moment that the mad Sith scientist pulls off this universe-altering feat. We know that Plagueis' ability to create life wasn't something that he had achieved all at one time. It came in smaller steps, first with his ability to at least prolong a being's death, then mastering resuscitating them from death itself. In order to become the master of life though, he had to first master death. Later, Plagueis would turn his studies to the midichlorians, learning how to force them to replicate themselves and stop their own cycle of death. This began a cycle of reversing age and disease, but at first not on himself, rather his test subjects. We've detailed the vile experiments of Darth Plagueis in other videos, but needless to say it took many decades and thousands of lives would need to be sacrificed to the machine of research. This wasn't until Plagueis decided that it was time to take both the Sith and his experiments to the next level. Both he and Sidious could sense that the time of the Sith Grand Plan was near, and the Sith had began making plans for the Clone Wars, securing an army, and manipulating the Jedi Sifo-Dyas. It was time to tip the scales of the dark and the light. In order to continue making their plans happen, the Sith would need to blind the sight of the Jedi, giving themselves more power in the process and more ability to work in the shadows. The Plagueis novel describes how he and Palpatine spent an extraordinary amount of time in deep meditation, concentrating on the cosmic force. The Sith's efforts were to fundamentally shift the balance of the Force in the favor of the dark side, something that at first seemed impossible, but that they actually achieved. The novel reads this: the shift had been the outcome of months of intense meditation, during which Plagueis and Sidious had sought to challenge the Force for sovereignty and suffuse the galaxy with the power of the dark side. Brazen and shameless, and at their own mortal peril, the Sith waged etheric war, even anticipating that their own midichlorians, the Force's army, might marshal to boil their blood or stop the beating of their hearts. Risen out of themselves, discorporate, and as a single entity, they had brought the power of their will to bear, asserting their sovereignty over the Force. No counterforce had risen against them. In what amounted to a state of rapture, they knew that the Force had yielded, as if some deity had been tipped from its throne. On the fulcrum they had fashioned, the light side had dipped, and the dark side had ascended. Making sense of the passage, what had essentially happened was that Plagueis and Sidious literally fought the Force itself. In doing this, they risked the potential of their own living cells rising against them to destroy their bodies in the most gruesome way imaginable. But by combining their power, Sidious and Plagueis won this battle of wills with the Force and brought about this shift of balance, tipping the scales. This incredibly abhorrent move set the stage for Plagueis going too far. It was after this event that he had finally crossed the threshold of near perfection in manipulating the midichlorians. We've talked many times about what he did to Venomous, and what happened on the same day that this shift in the Force happened, by letting Venomous die, and then bringing him back to life repeatedly. Plagueis displayed his mastery over death to other beings. He even began to influence his own midichlorians to reverse some of the damage done to him. He had himself looking slightly younger and healed many of his major injuries. While his throat remained heavily damaged after the attempt on his life, he could breathe better than he had in decades. The healing was not perfect, but it was still no small feat for any Sith. Healing abilities are scarce in the dark side's arsenal, so when a Dark Lord finds a way to use dark healing, it is incredibly rare and comes at a terrible cost. But for Plagueis, the only cost was that it took slower and wasn't quite perfect. But here things get dicey. Up until this point, Plagueis had been experimenting with the creation of life. By taking non-sentient creatures, he had influenced their midichlorians to make fetuses, essentially creating life. These fetuses, though, had now grown into full creatures within test tubes in his laboratory. But now, he was ready to go beyond simple, non-sentient creatures. Drunk on his own newfound power, he had attempted an even more unthinkable act, to bring into being a creation of his own. Not merely the impregnation of mindless creatures, but the birth of a forceful being. So Plagueis stretched out with his presence to inform every single being of his existence in the Force, with his own species, insectoid, human, slave, or free. All of their biology would know of Plagueis and have his impact left on them. But this is where most people get it wrong and assume that Plagueis knew of Anakin, because after Plagueis did this, nothing actually happened. The Force grew completely silent, as if it was fleeing from him. All the animals he had grown in his lab had succumbed to horrifying diseases and had died. The Force was done with Darth Plagueis. The ritual was a failure. No, you can't. I will not let you. In complete rejection of this Sith Lord, the Force used what he had intended against him. It brings about the birth of Anakin. The time had come for the chosen one of prophecy to be made known to the galaxy, now that balance had been destroyed by this madness. The balance decimated by the arrogance of Sith. Anakin was not a creation of Plagueis, it was the Force's failsafe against him. This is how Plagueis accidentally created Anakin, and 9 years later, he would be terrified of the young boy, and Palpatine would see great opportunity. When Sidious heard from Dooku that Qui-Gon claimed to have found the Chosen One, a boy born of no father with an unprecedented amount of midichlorians, Palpatine nearly swallowed his tongue. While trying to maintain cover, Palpatine got as much information out of Dooku as possible before rushing to tell Plagueis. Upon hearing this, the Dark Lord actually went into a state of panic. Plagueis was terrified of Anakin and believed that the Sith were now undone because of this single ritual. In the brief time that Anakin and Qui-Gon were on Coruscant, Plagueis watched them from the shadows, trying to find a way to get his hands on the boy before the Jedi realized who he really was. Ironically, it was at that moment that Qui-Gon was explaining to Anakin what midichlorians actually were. While the manipulator of them was watching through macro binoculars, Plagueis reached out with the Force in order to gauge a sense of the boy and his power. More important though, his destiny. In an instant, a series of perplexing images raced across Plagueis' vision. Great battles in deep space, lightsabers clashing, a black-suited cyborg slowly rising from a table. Plagueis didn't know it at the time, but he had literally just watched the Clone Wars, as well as the creation of Lord Vader. Yet, while still on this balcony on Coruscant, he was completely unsure of what he had seen. All Plagueis knew, though, was that everything hinged on Qui-Gon Jinn. The lesson here is the Force will always seek to correct itself whenever it is thrown out of balance, even if that means doing something drastic. What Plagueis and Sidious attempted to do by usurping sovereignty within the Force was the ultimate offense, the ultimate sin. No greater arrogance had been seen from the Sith, not since the time of Valkorion. The final straw, though, was Plagueis' abuse of life itself, his intention to create his own life, putting himself in the place of godhood above the Force. No better time for the Chosen One to be selected than this, when the Force had to reject the one who had perverted it. Ironically, both the Jedi and Sith were leaning far too heavily into both their respective sides of the Force, resulting in a wildly out of balance state in the galaxy, and a very tumultuous time of war, even if the war was not always a visible one. While Anakin's destiny revolved around destroying the Sith, he did so by also destroying the Jedi along the way, bringing balance to the Force upon his death. The Force will always correct itself, by any means necessary. But now, my friends, what are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on Plagueis and his attempt to create life, as well as the birth of Anakin Skywalker? Reach out and subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. It is your destiny, we have foreseen it, and have an absolutely amazing day.